before you judge this case, ask yourself one thing. If someone you loved was found dead under suspicious but convenient circumstances and investigators closed the file in record time, would you accept their conclusion, or would you spend the rest of your life wondering what they missed? Because that's exactly the nightmare Camila Mendoza Olmos' family is living. They say the notes weren't goodbyes, they were warnings. They say the truth wasn't uncovered, it was buried. And the most unsettling part, once you hear what they discovered, you might start to wonder whether we, the public, were too quick to look away. Listen carefully, because this is one of those cases that does not fade with time. It grows heavier the more you think about it. A young woman is gone. A family is left with fragments of words, unfinished thoughts, and an official explanation that feels too small to hold the weight of their loss. The name is Camila Mendoza Olmos, and what happened to her has become a question that refuses to rest, no matter how many times it's been labeled as answered. Authorities called it a suicide. One conclusion, one line in a report, one stamp of finality. To the system, that meant resolution. To her family, it felt like the beginning of a second loss. Because once a case is closed, the questions don't disappear, they just stop being welcomed. And Camila's family had questions. They still do. Questions that echo in empty rooms and late-night thoughts. Questions that sound like this. If she was saying goodbye, why did her words sound like fear? If she was ready to leave, why did her messages sound like someone begging to be understood? Camila was not just a name in a file. She was a presence. She had routines, habits, worries, dreams that didn't fit neatly into a conclusion. People who knew her say she was struggling, yes, but struggling is not the same as surrendering. And that distinction matters, because the notes left behind were interpreted in two completely different ways. Investigators saw them as farewells. Her family saw them as alarms. And when two truths are born from the same evidence, the question becomes, who decides which one is allowed to stand? This is where the tension tightens. The investigation moved fast, too fast, according to those who loved her. They say there were details that deserved more time, more attention, more care. But time is expensive, and answers that complicate things are even more costly. So the case was closed. Efficient, clean, official. And yet the story did not end. It leaked into the online world where people who had never met Camila felt the same unease. Something didn't sit right. Something felt unfinished. Every shared post, every comment thread, every late-night video analysis became part of a growing refusal to accept closure without clarity. This wasn't about spectacle, it was about discomfort, about that quiet feeling you get when you're told to move on, but your instincts say, don't. Camila's family was told, directly and indirectly, to accept the ruling, to stop asking, to stop pushing, to stop reopening something that was already decided. But how do you stop when the words left behind still feel alive? Here is the truth no one likes to say out loud. When a death is ruled a suicide, the world exhales. There is no suspect to chase, no system to examine, no uncomfortable accountability to face. It is the easiest ending, and that ease can be deeply unsettling for the people who are left behind. Camila's family wasn't asking for a story that felt better. They were asking for one that felt honest, and those are not always the same thing. The notes became the center of everything. A few lines of text, a handful of phrases, suddenly held the power to define an entire life and its ending. Were they goodbyes, or were they cries for help? Were they acceptance or confusion? The official interpretation became law, but interpretation is not the same as fact. It is shaped by perspective, by pressure, by the need to conclude. And once a narrative is written into a report, it becomes very hard to erase. The online community didn't let it go. They replayed timelines, they examined words, they listened to the family, and what they found was not certainty, but doubt. Doubt that the investigation had gone far enough, doubt that the questions had been taken seriously, doubt that Camila's voice had been fully heard. And doubt is powerful because it spreads quietly and it doesn't disappear when you tell it to stop. But here is where the story becomes even more complicated. Questioning an investigation is not the same as accepting reality, and accepting a ruling is not the same as understanding it. Somewhere between those two truths is a line that families are forced to walk alone. On one side is the world telling them to accept what cannot be changed. On the other is the instinct that says something is missing. And no one can tell them when to stop searching because no one else has to live with the silence. Camila's name continues to circulate, not because people are obsessed with tragedy, but because people recognize the pattern. The pattern of rushed closure, the pattern of unanswered questions, the pattern of families being told their doubts are just grief speaking. And maybe sometimes they are. But maybe sometimes grief is only sharp enough to notice what others overlook. This case asks something uncomfortable of all of us. How much questioning is too much? When does the search for justice become a refusal to accept pain? And who gets to decide when a story is truly over? Because when a life ends, the aftermath doesn't follow a timeline. It lingers. It reshapes itself. It waits for someone to listen. Camila Mendoza Olmos is not here to clarify her words. She cannot explain what she meant or what she felt in those final moments. All that remains are interpretations, decisions, and the weight of not knowing. And that weight is now shared by everyone who has read her name, who has heard her family's voice, who has felt that quiet discomfort settle in their chest. If this case makes you uneasy, that's because it's supposed to. Unease is what happens when answers arrive too quickly. If you believe stories like this deserve time, care, and attention, then don't let this be where it ends. Share this with someone who still believes that questions are not disrespectful, they are necessary. Subscribe to this channel for long-form investigations that refuse to rush past the details that matter. Turn on notifications so you never miss the cases that demand more than silence. Because once we stop asking, once we stop listening, the truth doesn't disappear. It just becomes easier to ignore.
And this is the part where the silence gets louder, because after the ruling was announced, after the headlines moved on, Camila's family was left alone with something far heavier than grief: doubt. Doubt is cruel because it doesn't let you rest. It replays moments, rereads words, and asks questions that have no place to land. Every time they looked at those notes, they felt it again, that quiet pull in the chest that says, this is not the whole truth. And when you live with that feeling long enough, it stops being a question and becomes a responsibility. They tried to speak, they tried to be heard, but when a case is closed, voices become inconvenient. The system doesn't like reopened doors, and it doesn't like lingering shadows, so the family did what families do when the world stops listening. They turned to anyone who would hear them. They shared what they could. They explained what they saw. They repeated themselves even when it hurt, because repeating was the only way to keep Camila from becoming a footnote. And here is where guilt quietly enters the room, because everyone who hears this story has to ask themselves something uncomfortable. How many times have we scrolled past a case like this? How many times have we trusted a headline because it was easier than sitting with uncertainty? How many times have we accepted an ending simply because it was official? The truth is, the system depends on our silence. It depends on our distraction. It depends on us moving on. The online community didn't move on. They paused. They listened. They noticed the gaps. They noticed how fast everything ended, how quickly the questions were dismissed, how neatly everything was packaged,
and they began to ask the same thing Camila's family had been asking all along. What if the investigation ended before the truth had time to surface? What if the notes were not a conclusion, but a signal? What if the rush to close the case was not about clarity, but about convenience? These questions don't accuse, they challenge. They challenge a process that sometimes mistakes speed for accuracy. They challenge a culture that treats grief as noise once it becomes uncomfortable. They challenge us, the audience, because once you hear them, you can't unhear them. Once you know a family is still searching, you can't pretend the story is finished. Camila's absence became louder than her presence ever was. Her name stopped being just a name and became a reminder of what happens when answers come too easily. Her family kept speaking even when their voices shook, even when they were told they were holding on too tightly. But holding on is not a crime. Wanting understanding is not denial. And refusing to accept a version of events that feels incomplete is not madness. It is love. And here is the part that should make you uncomfortable, because it's easier to believe families are mistaken than to believe the system might have overlooked something. It's easier to say grief is clouding their judgment than to admit we might have closed the door too soon. But every time we choose comfort over curiosity, we teach the world that unanswered questions don't matter. And that is how stories like this fade before they are finished. Camila Mendoza Olmos is not a headline. She is not a file. She is not a conclusion. She is a person whose final words are still being interpreted by people who cared enough to look twice. And whether the official ruling stands forever or not, the unease remains, because no report can erase the feeling that something was left behind, something unresolved, something waiting. So, the next time you hear a case is closed, ask yourself who it was closed for. The next time a family refuses to stop asking, ask yourself why their persistence makes people uncomfortable. And the next time you feel that tug in your chest while listening to something like this, don't ignore it. That feeling is awareness, and awareness is the first step towards accountability. If you believe stories like this deserve more than silence, more than a rushed ending, then do not let this be where Camila's name stops. Share this video so more people can hear what questions sound like when they refuse to disappear. Subscribe to this channel for long-form investigations that take the time others won't. Turn on notifications so you don't miss the stories that need witnesses, not just viewers. Because once attention disappears, so does the pressure for truth. And the least we can do, the absolute least, is refuse to look away.